Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Crypto News Podcast. We're buzzing. As always, we love to buzz on the Crypto News Pod, and I'm super pumped to have today's guest on the show. This will be a unique one as we get to talk about something that I'm sure a couple of the listeners love to sip on every once in a while, and that is booze. Cannot wait. Here we are, Nimantha Siriwardana. Nim, my apologies, I probably butchered your name, but we have Nim, the co-founder and CTO of Metacask, the marketplace for high-quality spirits. Nim spearheads the platform, helping producers and brands streamline the transaction process and introduce NFTs as digital proofs of purchase. Metacask also offers the spirit industry's first fully integrated inventory management, asset tracking, and marketing solution. Nim has over 20 years of experience in delivering tech solutions, and prior to co-founding Metacask, he served as the CTO of GSR and worked across various financial services companies, including Goldman Sachs and Source Capital AG. Without further ado, I'm very pumped to have Nim on the show. Nim, welcome to the show, my friend.
Hi, Matt. Thanks very much for having me on the show. I'm really looking forward to the next hour or so of this conversation, right?
Me too. Super pumped to have you on. When we had the opportunity to make this happen, this really piqued my interest because it's just such a unique value prop you guys have. Like there's, to my knowledge, there aren't a whole lot of people doing this in this space, and drinking is something that's so commonplace in today's day and age. It's part of culture. Doesn't matter what part of the world you live in, having a lovely glass or two of something is an absolute treat. And you are tokenizing that. Yeah, speaking of what you're doing right now, what are you sipping on?
So I actually have a little shot of, it's actually a sample from a little distillery in Scotland. Well, not so little anymore. They're called Annandale. And so I've had a sample on my desk for the last 6 months since we sponsored this castle party of Trevor Jones's last year. Right? And so I figured it's time to open it and give it a go. And so here I am with it. So I hope you don't mind. While I
to be honest, it's 3 p.m. as I record right now, and that's not too early at all, but big rookie move on my part. I definitely should have had a glass of something here in Mexico, probably tequila. But before we get into Metacask and yourself, talk to me about some of your favorite drinks you've ever had. Was there one sip in particular where you just had your mind absolutely blown off? Like for me, I had I forget the name of it. It was at a lovely bar in Toronto, and I want to say it was 18-year Japanese whiskey, probably the best whiskey I've ever tasted in my life. And at that same place, the best red wine I've ever had in my life as well. I was with an old colleague of mine, / boss, who is very wealthy and treated us to it. And that was incredible. Also, shout out Tony G in Dubai, had some incredible wine and booze with him too. But any sips of wine or whiskey or cognac or tequila or anything that just absolutely blew your socks off and you still think of to this day?
Oh yeah, for sure. So in 21, around November time, actually October, we auctioned a barrel of whiskey from Macallan. That was made in 1991. So at the time, it was something like 30 years old. Right? And as part of the process of verifying this thing, that it physically existed, the liquid is all good to go. I was lucky enough to actually receive a sample from this barrel. And so I got delivered a nondescript little bottle. I don't know if you've ever seen a sample bottle that they bring to you from barrels, right? They're very small samples, about 250 ml normally. And opened this, poured this into a little glass, tasted a 30-year-old Macallan for the first time. And that is something you'll never forget, right? The reality is if you look at a 30-year-old Macallan these days, if you go into retail, if you can find one, right, you're looking to pay somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 for a bottle, right? And it's not the kind of thing that you normally open, right? And so you would collect it for sure, but it's very unlikely you would sip on it. And so having a sample directly from this barrel, it was amazing, right? And I think I don't think I'm going to see anything that's going to top that, except maybe the next barrel that we're going to auction. But we can talk about that at some other point.
So a 30-year-old, like, what does that even taste like? I think the oldest I've ever done was, I think it was probably a 21 or 22 Glenfiddich.
Right. Oh, it's the smells that you get from this is something that you're not going to find anywhere else, right? It's like fine wines and a standard table wine that you would have a bottle of, right? There are so many different levels of complexity and taste. I'm not a snob. I wouldn't be able to say, oh, I can distinguish this particular note and that particular note, whether it's in smell or taste, right? But the reality is that the moment that thing enters your mouth and you hit the smell hits your nose, you can tell there's something special about it, right? And you don't have to be told what it is. There is a difference. You can tell chalk and cheese. Now I'm drinking this and then I know what this smells and tastes like, right? And yet, I still remember what that smells and tastes like. And that's the kind of thing that, it leaves that sort of fingerprint in your mind about what it tastes like, right? And you never forget it. Same with the best bottle of wine I've ever had, right? That was like I think it was a Bordeaux from France at some point. I forget this specific vintage and the chateau. I think it was 1991 as well, right? You decant it for a few hours so that you build up to that experience, right? And once it's been decanted, they bring it out to you, put it in glass, and the first sip you take, it's like there are so many different flavors. Your mind is immediately blown, right? And you compare it to your table wine, you're like, okay, well, I'm not drinking that anymore. just continue pouring this for me, right? That's what you experience when you first try something like that, right? And so this Macallan, obviously, that's what sort of stays in my mind, right? But to be honest, pretty soon after that, I tried a Glen Clark cask, so that's a 30-year-old as well, and that's really nice, but it's a little bit more smoother. But that memory of the 91 that doesn't go away. Sure.
I love that. I love the description too about knowing where you are in the room and just, that's incredible. That's one of my goals. I'd love to be able to hopefully be wealthy enough that I can treat my loved ones to, $5,000 bottle of wine and not even blink an eye, instead of it being like, this is going to hurt. It's just, here's a bottle, there's a bottle.
It's an experience, right? I think the interesting thing is it's all about experience, right? So, you go through life, you should accumulate experiences, right? You can accumulate all the money you want, but the problem is at the end of it, if you have not had any experiences along the way, right? You kind of almost missed out, right? So I think accumulating experience is really the way forward, right? And that's something that, definitely keep in mind, right? And certainly it's like how I'm trying to factor my life, right? Experiences.
100%. Tell me about Metacask. One, I love the name. When I first read it, I was just like, this is like, it just doesn't get a whole lot better than that. Your MetaMask, your Metacask, like it's absolute cash. So kudos to you and the team. Phenomenal name. I love the idea. I love the founding story. You gotta tell me it again and let our listeners hear about how you and the team came up with this idea.
Sure. So beginning of 21, I got approached by a whiskey broker in the UK. So I think the same concept exists in the US. So if you want to buy a barrel of whiskey, for example, often you might be building, let's say, an alternative asset portfolio of some sort, right? And so what happens is there are these brokers who sell you access to these barrels at distilleries, or perhaps even barrels that are in private collectors' hands, right? And so I got approached by such a broker in the UK, and then they said, okay, why don't you invest in a portfolio of whiskey? Right? So I started looking at it, and then looked at how the process worked, and realized it was actually very manual, paper-based. I really relied on these brokers, keeping good records for all this inventory that you could potentially end up owning, right? And so at the time, this is beginning of 21, NFTs were really starting to become mainstream, right? There was, this kind of wave of adoption. And so I kind of flipped the approach back and went back to the broker and I said, look, instead of me investing in whiskey and buying this thing, here's an idea, right? We could use NFTs to actually try to simplify this process. By simplifying, we can also start, putting provenance down on the chain, right? And recording a whole bunch of useful information. And actually, more importantly, if I bought this stuff, right, I can prove this, I own this thing and record that,
yeah.
And so they looked at it and they were really forward thinking. So Stuart is my co-founder from Metacask. He's also the MD of the broker. He basically looked at it and said, yeah, this actually solves a real problem for us, right? Because right now it's a real pain in the neck. We have to go back and figure out where this thing came from, what state it's in, where it's at, who owns it, who's owned it in the past. That information is not available beyond the last sale, right? And so there's a lot of, processes that we could actually, make more efficient, right, by going down this route. And so he said, yeah, well, let's do this. And so we got together and we basically started, building out Metacask. Actually, one of the other co-founders, one of the guys I used to work with at GSR, he came up with the name Metacask. So I have to thank him for that, Rich. He was instrumental. We did have some problems with it in the early days because obviously Metacask, and so we were getting blacklisted on lots of different sites because of Metacask. But thankfully, the team there, whitelisted us, so we're okay now.
I love that. So, like, give me if you were to alleviate one of the pain points of these distributors or authenticators or anyone within sort of that vertical of the industry, what gets them going the most? Like what, and again, obviously you guys alleviate a lot of pain points, but what in particular is there like, oh shit, this is the sauce, this is it, we need this?
Right. So from VCL's perspective, which is the actual broker that came to me, right? Their biggest concern, and this still exists at the moment, is the ownership of the actual underlying barrel is often in their name at the warehouse. So it might be that you actually own the barrel, but there's actually this record that VCL has to keep, right? And most brokers also do this, which says, okay, this barrel belongs to you, but actually at the warehouse, the barrel is in the name of VCL, right? And this is real, this is a situation that happens right now because most warehouses, they can't scale to, individual users owning single assets in their warehouses, right? I mean, as you can imagine, there's lots of these warehouses. There's like 21 million barrels up in Scotland. There's 22 in, what was it, Kentucky or Tennessee, right? So if you factor
wait, there's 21 million barrels?
Oh, yeah. In Scotland, for sure.
What?
Yeah. There's a lot that can be tokenized. It's not a small amount. Right? Yeah.
That's insane.
That's on any average year, right? So, they're constantly producing and taking away, obviously, as things, stock is maturing, right? Keep in mind also, Scotch, it can't be called Scotch unless it's at least 3 years old, right? And so there's a minimum maturation period where this thing has to sit there, right? And then it'll often get blended in. There's a lot of blends going on, right? As you're probably aware, right? But the number is, pretty much the same when you look across the states. If you go to any of the whiskey producing states, they'll have similar numbers of barrels in inventory, right? But the reality is that some of this stuff will be in private collectors' hands, but some of it will be owned via brokers, right? And that's really where the problem, starts off at, right? Especially if the broker's got a business, for example, right? How do I, prove that I own this asset? And for brokers, the biggest problem is they've got to somehow keep these records in a way that makes sure that if they get liquidated, right, those assets aren't considered part of the broker's assets. They're actually considered separate and belongs to other people, right? And this is a really hard problem to solve in general, right? And so, that's really where the blockchain can help because the blockchain records that in a transparent and public and so forth way. Right? All these other benefits that you get, there are ancillary benefits. The fact that you can prove that ownership, that's significant. If you think about it, right, a lot of this is coming down to law. Like you go to a court, you can argue your case, right? And you need evidence, right? You need weight of evidence.
Black and white.
Right?
Black
and so
and white,
if you can prove this is my digital account, this is my token that's in there, this is therefore mine, right? That's more weight to your argument. And that's really what the blockchain is going to provide in this.
When did you first learn about like the asset class of spirits and, these very rich men and women having wine cellars? I remember growing up and, I was fortunate enough to play on my family was always middle class, but I got to play with some very wealthy families because hockey is usually a pretty wealthy sport. And a couple of my friends, their parents had little, wine cellars in the basement. And like, that was so foreign to me, right? And you walk in, you see these incredible bottles of wine, and then my buddy's dad would, tell a couple stories. Oh, this one's worth 20 grand, that's worth, 40 grand, blah, blah, blah. And so foreign, so baffling to me. But like, when did you first learn about the asset class of spirits, of wine, of liquor? That I just find that so interesting.
So, I mean, in terms of spirits, I always considered, well, I'm just going to drink it, right? I'm not going to collect it and invest in it.
Yeah.
And it never really occurred to me that it could be an alternative asset class, right? I knew that there was a group of people who were collecting wine. So, there's a lot of, let's say if you buy if you try to buy Burgundy, for example, right? I mean, these days it's virtually impossible because all the good stuff is sold out very quickly, way ahead of time, right? Because Burgundy is considered like an investment grade wine, right? These are like $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $15,000, $16,000 bottles of wine, right? So I knew that this concept had existed. What I didn't really realize was how big the actual whiskey, let's say, cask collector or at least investment spaces, right? I think that's the biggest shock, right? When I looked at it.
And Nim, one quick question. When you're talking about the cask itself, that's people who are in literally, let's say, I'll pick one that I'm familiar with, Woodford Reserve, right? Bourbon in good old Kentucky, right?
Yes.
Would that be that someone they own that cask in the Woodford sort of factory or the Woodford sort of stable at the time, the warehouse?
Yeah, so that's how it works in Scotland, for example, right? So in the States, I'd imagine it's exactly the same in the sense that while the barrel is maturing, right, it would sit there actually in the warehouse, right? And I think at some point you can obviously have it bottled and then delivered, right? I don't know in the States specifically if there's you can have the barrel delivered, right? Which I'm assuming is the thing, but in the UK at least, it's not possible to have the barrel delivered. The barrel must sit in the warehouse. And another really interesting aspect of this is that a lot of this inventory is actually sitting in bonded warehouses, right? So they're not just, some shed in the middle of a field somewhere. They're actually, it's almost like you have to go through a process before you can actually open up and set up a bonded warehouse, right? The bonded warehouse brings along all sorts of requirements. Like, for example, you've got to report. In the UK, you have to report to the HMRC, which is the revenue services, right? And you've got to tell the revenue services every month, every quarter, oh, this is how much liquid I have that's stored at my warehouse, right? And so it sets up the space quite nicely because you know that the underlying physical asset that we're dealing with is actually not going to go for a walk. It's going to sit there until it's mature. Right? And so digital ownership of that really kind of was just the next step along, right? And so it made sense. But yeah, from that perspective, the fact that the asset has to sit there, the barrel will sit there until it matures, right? I think that makes things a little bit easier. And the lifetimes of these things, I mean, it's insane, The oldest barrel that we have access to is 54 years old, right? You can imagine it's just sat there for 54 years. It's like, what's it doing? They're gathering dust. It just sits there for 54 years. But that's really where all the flavor and the complexity in the whiskey comes from.
That's such a weird, how do you even explain that though? You know what I mean? Like to someone who doesn't understand booze, like imagine telling someone the longer you let like these grapes or this wheat, malt and barley or whatever, the longer you let this sit in a wooden friggin' barrel, the better it tastes. That just is so ass backwards. Wouldn't you think it'd get like moldy and it would evaporate and it would just become just an absolute cesspool of grossness? But like, no, it just locks in the flit like
no,
crazy.
Unfortunately, the problem is that you do get some of that too, right? So you do get spoiled barrels. That can happen if the barrel is not stored correctly in the right conditions and so on, right? But you have to understand that these guys who've been working this stuff, they've been working this stuff for hundreds of years, right? So they've got a lot of experience, right? They know exactly how to store these things, how to look after these things, how to care for these things, right? And so the likelihood of spoils, I mean, it does happen, but it's going to be fairly sort of on the low end, right? But the reality is, the best thing you can do is just leave it there, right? But the thing is, I say you leave it there. The reality is you don't just leave it there. You do have to test it periodically to make sure that it's still progressing, right? You'll get to a point where you can mature the liquid for a really long period of time. But you probably heard of this concept of the angel share, right? Which, is basically where the liquid sort of evaporates over time, right? As the liquid is maturing, a certain percentage of it, the alcohol percentage of it also evaporating. The concept is in the old days, you used to say the angels were having a tipple once in a while, right? And so that's really where it all comes from, right? But the reality is over time, that liquid level goes down. And so the number of bottles you're going to potentially get out of it sort of reduces, right? But you also get to the point where the alcohol level drops below a certain point. So for example, in Scotland, you can't have it drop below 40%. If it goes below 40%, then it's not really considered, Scotch whiskey, right? And so as a result, you have to make sure that you're monitoring this as well periodically. You test the barrel. So that's where you take out a sample and you measure it, right? And you check the alcohol levels and so on. Yeah. So there's a whole process that they go through. We call it regauging. So regauging is a process of testing that cask and checking that it's still in a good state, right? And you do this every sort of few years just to make sure that it's progressing. Yeah.
I was just going to say, if I were to own, like, let's say I own one of these barrels, a beautiful bottle of Scotch in Scotland, and let's say I started this when I was 18, 10 years ago. Now I'm 28 and I'm like, you know what, it's time. I want to invite my family over, have my boys over, and we're going to crack it open. Again, you said they won't deliver it to your house, but are they going to like bottle it up and put, this has been aged for, I don't know, let's say it's a 18-year banger. Are they going to take it, slap labels on it, give me the whole shebang, the whole 9 yards? Like, how does that whole process work when I actually want to get the alcohol itself?
So yeah, you have to have it bottled for sure before you get it delivered. That's the first step, right? How you
Right.
get it bottled really depends on what the original terms of the contract was when you actually bought the barrel. Right? So there are some programs by some distilleries where they'll give you bottling rights along with the barrel itself, right? So what that means is when you come to, to have it bottled, you can actually use their brand, the name. Maybe there's a special variation of it, something like this, to actually have the whiskey bottled, right? But mostly, especially a lot of the older stuff that was sold, they weren't really sold with many rights, right? And so what happens these days is a lot of the brands are quite protective of their IP, which as they should be, right? And so what ends up happening is if you want to open your barrel now and you want to have it like bottled, you would have to have it independently bottled. Right? And so what you see is there's a lot of independent bottlers who now have set up a kind of like a sideline job, right? And what they'll do is they'll take your barrel, they'll work with you to design a bottle, they'll work with you to design the label, because the labeling has to adhere to certain standards in Scotland, and I'm sure it's the same in the US, right? And so, they have to make sure that happens. So that's why you have a special label design with the bottle. And once that's all done, then they'll bottle it for you, and then they'll ship you the actual liquid itself, right? And depending on where you are, obviously there's import duties, all these other things that have to be factored in, right? Shipping costs and so on, yeah. But for sure, there may be some rare casks that are flying around that do include bottling rights. They tend to be a little bit more well sought after, but they're really hard to find if you can find them. And again, this is another thing, right? So how do you keep that information and preserve it over like 30 years' time? Oh, there's actually bottling rights for this cask. That's, again, a really, useful aspect of putting stuff onto a blockchain, right? It'll just be there and you can always be sure.
It makes so much sense. I could see one of these, like a lot of guys who won, when they have that much money, I'm sure they're not flipping this for profit. It's probably just for personal consumption. But, that's the other thing I was curious about. Like, how many bottles of whiskey or how many bottles of scotch you get from a barrel? Dozens?
It's more than that. So, for example...
But could you, in theory, Nim, could I flip those if I wanted to? Like, could I then take my 40 bottles of scotch and then sell those individually? Like, I own the scotch, don't I not?
Yeah, for sure. It's yours, right? So, for sure, you can do that. There's nothing preventing you. I mean, that's why I said, like, a lot of these independent bottlers, what they'll do is they'll bottle it and you can set up your own label around it, right? And there's going to be some restrictions on how you can sell this stuff, obviously, because, like in the US, for example, you'll need like liquor license and all the rest of that, right? But I mean, if you're just flipping one or two once in a while, I mean, I don't know like what the specific regulations would be. I'm not going to give you any legal advice, right? But it is, if you were to take that and chuck it on eBay, for example, as long as they don't restrict alcohol, there's nothing stopping you from doing that, right? And so I'm just saying that, you could potentially create a brand. You could work with a brand, right? And say, look, I have this special barrel. We can do this, right? The number of bottles, you'd be surprised. I mean, the 91 that I mentioned that we sold in 21, that had like 500 bottles in there, right? 500 bottles. That's a lot, right? So if you're going to have that bottle and deliver it, I mean, I hope you got a really strong liver, right? You're going to need it. But yeah, it varies.
Crazy.
You can get 150, 500. It just depends on the size of the barrel.
Right. So interesting. Man, this has luxury goods written all over it. Like NFTs and luxury goods. It's such a match made in heaven. Speaking of that, let's take a quick break. Got to give a huge shout out to our sponsor of the show, Prime XPT. We love the team at Prime XPT as they offer a robust trading system for both beginners and professional traders. Doesn't matter if you're a rookie or a vet. You can easily design and customize your layouts and widgets to best fit your trading style. Prime XPT is also running an exclusive promo for listeners of the Crypto News podcast. The promo code is CryptoNews50. That's CryptoNews50 to receive 50% of your deposit credited back to your trading account. Prime XPT hooking us all up. Again, the promo code is CryptoNews50 to receive 50% of your deposit credited to your trading account. And now back to the show with Nim. Nim, luxury goods, NFTs, match made in heaven. Obviously, beautiful bottles of whiskey, beautiful bottles of bourbon, scotch, luxury good. It's about as luxurious as it gets. We've seen luxury brands jump on the trend as well. This seems like the train has just left the station. How early are we in the sort of NFTs X luxury goods collab?
I think we're super early. I mean, that's very clear. We've talked to a bunch of brands who are looking to enter the space, right? And they're just starting to make their moves now. And so I think there's going to be a huge momentum, but it also depends on, really how they plan to integrate the technology into what they're doing, right? And there has to be a well thought through process. And this is the point that we've been emphasizing to a lot of brands. We've seen recently there's a whole bunch of drops that happen where they just ride the NFT bandwagon. We'll just put some stuff on there and see what happens, right? And that'll work to a point, but it's very short termist, right? And so if you want to have a long term plan, there has to be thought through plan about how do we transfer additional value to our consumers, right? And so, it's not just about dropping a bunch of NFTs and then forgetting about it. Right? You have to build around it. There has to be community building. There has to be constant, update around this is what's going to happen. This is the roadmap. This is the pipeline of stuff that we're going to deliver. But the additional utility, right? And so as long as there's a well thought through plan, it can happen. But as I said, a lot of the brands that we've talked to, they're definitely in the early stages. And so there's going to be some interesting changes coming down the next, year and a half, potentially, right? But it is really going to be the ones that are going to be lasting are the ones that have, thought through around utility, thought through around what additional value can they provide the end consumer, right? It's not just about, going there and taking their ETH and walking away. It's about, I've got now access to this consumer that I didn't have before. How do I provide them additional access? Right? It's a really, I think it's like one aspect of the blockchain that's almost overlooked, right? Which is that as a brand, you've got direct access to all of your consumers, right? At a level
Right
that you don't have at the moment, right? Right now, I sell a bottle through a supermarket, a store, whatever. I don't know who's bought it, right? I don't know, the fact that this person's going to consume it or whatever they're doing with it, right? Whereas if you attach that digital twin, you tell them, "Oh, go claim your digital twin," right? Now you've got a channel to that person. You can start sending them additional stuff, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things you can do, right? And that's really kind of the opportunity that we're trying to say, this is what exists on blockchain, if you actually look at it, right? Rather than just drop a few NFTs and move on,
It's so true. And again, that's why the whole spirits and, whiskey and bourbon, it makes so much sense. Wine, just anything where you want to know the person before you, like, who is this actually real? Is this authentic? Who is the previous owner? Anything. And that's a lot of luxury goods, right? Who owned this before me? Is this real? How do I know it's not a fake? That shit matters so much. Like, I'm even thinking about, I want to say there was a story a month ago. I'm sure I read it on Twitter. That's where I get most of my news, like most of us. But it was about some group in New York City, luxury wine guys. And this person was literally mixing a bunch of shitty red wines and selling them as like $10,000 vintages. I don't know if you remember that story, but it's like, that would have been so easy to authenticate if they're just jump on Metacask, see the previous owners, see if this actually came from the distributor, from this vineyard. It's so easy, right?
That's the source, right? I mean, you want to trust the source. The source is the distillery or the vineyard from where it came, right? And so, one of the things that we're trying to do is to go right to the distillery and say, look, when you create these tokens, you mint the token using your own digital account, right? Which is a verified thing that somebody can go and say, oh, that is the account that belongs to such and such a distillery, and that issued the NFT, which is attached to this physical bottle that I'm dealing with, right? And so that whole kind of it's almost like a chain of trust, right? Or that path is maintained, right? As long as the token is issued by the distillery, right? And so that you can't get without having that kind of blockchain. Plus, also you need another aspect of it, which is the whole IoT tech space, right? The Internet of Things. Without things like QR codes, NFC tags, whatever that is, the new sort of generations of tech that's coming through. Without that being able to connect back to what's on the blockchain, it kind of falls apart a little bit, right? But because we have access to all this technology, we don't have to invent anything. It's all there. We just need to repurpose it into this, right? And as we repurpose it, it gives that additional confidence to the person who's buying it, right? That what they're buying is, it's the right thing. It's the real thing.
It's just, it's perfect. It's an absolute match made in heaven. Nim, this has been a blast. I need to get some booze related hot takes out of you here. What's some of the most overrated sort of mainstream alcohol that people drink, in your opinion, or perhaps some of your distributors and some of your people who are absolute experts in the industry, where they're like, this is trash or this is so overrated, and on the flip side, maybe some incredibly underrated stuff? Give me a couple booze related hot takes.
I think if I start denigrating on somebody, I'm probably gonna annoy a bunch of brands, right? So I'll hold that back, right? I think that's more for a private conversation. There's a lot of stuff like that we can probably get into, right? From an underrated side of things, I think one of my favorite brands, as I mentioned at the top of the podcast, is Glenfarclas, right? Their stuff is severely underrated, I think, and so there's like I said, the 30-year-old, for example. It's a decent price. It's sub $1,000 bottle of whiskey, right? And so it's still in that kind of collectible range, and it's definitely worth getting into, worth having a look at. It's also not very peaty. So if you like peaty whiskey, it's not sort of in that range. It's a little bit more lightweight, easy access, right? But if you like peaty stuff, then obviously the Islay stuff is, hands down winner, right? But Glenfarclas is the one that I would say is kind of under the radar a little bit. And so, watch that for the next couple of years. I think there's going to be some interesting movement there, especially in the 30-year-old range, right? That's my favorite at the moment, for sure.
What's your take on the whole famous person and influencer dropping / releasing a new, whether it's, Nelk Boys with hard seltzer, or Ryan Reynolds with, I think, aviation gin, or George Clooney with, what did George do? Casamigos, was it?
Casamigos, yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting brand story. I mean, the history behind that, they didn't actually start it out as a brand that was going to sell tequila, right? I mean, it was, I want to drink some nice stuff, right? And so I want to have it made. But the only way they could have it made is if, they had set up a small company in the US to bring it in, right? And so that was the only way they could get access to the actual, producers down in tequila, right? And so it's a really interesting origin story. They created it for themselves, and then they shared it with their friends, and then their friends liked it and said, well, maybe there's something here. And then they expanded it out and suddenly it just went nuts, right? So I wouldn't necessarily say that's one where obviously having George Clooney on board helps. I'm not going to say no, right? But the reality is that the fact that, they started it out like that sort of sets a little bit more, or gives it a bit more credibility, if you will, right? And then you take the opposite of that. You've probably seen, was it one of the Kardashians? She's done Kylie, right? I think it was.
I don't even know what it's called. Like, I've never. It's weird though. It's like with the booze industry, in the alcohol industry, unless you get good distribution, I feel like you're hooped. Like, you know what I mean? Like, without, that it's just so paramount to success. It's not. With social media nowadays, if you have a software company, yes, you still need the distribution, but like, people can go to you. Whereas with booze, it's still a physical product, so you have to get it in their hands. And like, again, like Casamigos, for example, that I don't even remember seeing Casamigos in the stores like 5-6 years ago, and now it's just front and center. It's everywhere, And like another new one is Class Azul. Like, that's the new bougie thing to do. I'm sure you know Class Azul, of course, but it's craziness. It's just, if you have the distribution, and the easiest way to have distribution is to use your clout, right? So that's why these influencers and these famous people are starting tequila brands. Elon Musk friggin' sold out in 30 seconds. His Bolt tequila probably tasted like shit, $500 a pop. Like, I just find this whole industry so intriguing and unique, and it's one of the few industries where almost everyone takes part of it. Like, so many people drink. It's part of our culture.
There's a huge market. I mean, the revenues in this space are insane. If you look at the yearly revenues annually, right, in the spirits industry, I mean, it's north of like $500 billion annually, right? I mean, that's a large number, right? And so, if you like, that's annually. That's not even like, through the entire lifetime, right? So 500 billion annually, right? It's like twice in 2 years, the market cap for Bitcoin is just made up just from the revenue selling spirits, right? And so, if you look at it like that, I think there is enough capacity there, and people are always after something interesting. And so, one of the things that a lot of the brands have picked up on is obviously this premiumization concept, right? These days we're happy to splash a little bit more if we're getting good quality and we know where it's coming from, right? And that's another thing that I think people will start to focus a lot more on, which is, where did this thing come from? Has it been responsibly made, right? And so there's a lot of this kind of information that should also be provided by the producers, right? And again, I don't want to go back to the whole blockchain thing, but that's like a perfect application for it. You expose all this information about your production, where these ingredients are sourced from, your carbon footprints, your energy usage, all these things. We talk about it a lot on the blockchain space, but we don't talk about it in terms of all of these other things that we consume, right? And so having that information exposed, right, and having a mechanism that allows the producers to expose this information directly to your consumers, right, that's going to change the way we're going to consume, right? We're going to look at it and go, yeah, okay, this is, ethically sourced, responsibly produced, right?
That matters so much.
Right.
Yeah, people care about that nowadays. It's so true. Nim, this was an absolute treat, man. At this, I could talk to you for days. I have so many questions. Perhaps we'll let it fly off the record, but we are getting tight for time. Thank you so much for coming on. You definitely need to come back on for round 2. And at the pace that you guys are moving and grooving, I'm sure that there will be a lot of news in the next couple months. But until then, can you please let our listeners know where they can find you and Metacask online and on socials?
Sure. Metacask.com is our site. So you'll find all of our listings, products on there, right? We do have something interesting dropping in the next couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for that. And on socials, Twitter, LinkedIn, we're there as Metacask as well. So hit us up.
Nim, thank you so much, bro. Appreciate it, and can't wait until the next one.
Thanks for having me on, Matt. It's good chatting to you.
Folks, what an episode with Nim. This one was too much fun. I know a lot of us are drinkers from time to time, and seeing how NFTs can help revolutionize and help the classic and 1,000-year-old industry grow. Very, very interesting stuff. Do go check out metacask.com. As always, I will include everything in the show notes. Really hope you guys enjoyed this one. Quick shout out to my team. Love you guys so much for everything. Eustace, my amazing sound editor. Appreciate all your hard work. And to the listeners, love you guys. Keep on growing those bags and keep on staying healthy, wealthy, and happy. Bye for now, and we'll talk soon.